Hey, this third video in our publishing cycle and peer review lectures video series, I want to talk about authorship, and this means about determining who is an author, who gets to determine that, what criteria to take into consideration around determining who's an author, and also thinking around how to approach uh, how to even talk to other authors about authorship, which is, I think, something that a lot of research and academic writers don't do often enough. From the humanities, which is my background, we tend to be often just single authors, although that's changing as well. In the STEM sciences, however, that is really, or in the STEM academic fields, that is not the case at all. It is usually uh, a group of people, sometimes a pretty large group. I mean, there have been papers with literally hundreds of authors, so it's a little, big studies, lots of people contribute. So it's absolutely of the essence to always talk about as you're working on a project, especially if you're maybe not the main author or the main, principal investigator of a grant, or the head of the lab, or even the postdoc fellow or research, whatever. If you're just a person working in the lab and you're contributing to the publication, always talk to your colleagues around what does authorship for this project mean once the work gets published. So let me share with you how our School of Medicine defines authorship, which is a pretty standard way of defining authorship. This was approved by the School of Medicine Council on January 27th. Again, my colleague, Professor Adam Pouchet, the Department of Anatomy and Neurobiology at UMB, was gracious enough to let me use some of his slides to put these together and save me a lot of work. So there are three criteria that are related that help us determine who should be an author. The first one here is somebody who is being considered an author has to have made substantial contributions to conception and design, acquisition of data, analysis or interpretation of data. So acquisition of data means do folks who do carry out the experiments in the lab, should they be authors on the article? I would say yes. There is room for interpretation though here, right? So again, this is something that each research team needs to talk to each other on a consistent basis around who is considered an author. And then it becomes very tricky, and I'll talk about this in a moment, about the order of authors. So that's something I have reserved for the last slide. So again, getting back to this policy. So number one criteria, somebody who substantially contributed to conception and design, acquisition of data, analysis, interpretation of data, so these could be mutually exclusive, or people could have done both, or somebody who has made a substantial contribution to drafting, reviewing, and or revising the content of the publication for important intellectual content. This is an area that's really interesting. So I've worked with a lot of doctoral students. I teach in a palliative care doctoral program, and the students there are writing review articles in the class that I teach in the spring. And the students have all asked me if I wanted to be a co-author on their papers, and I always say no. Because even though one could argue that I make substantial contributions to reviewing and revising the content of their publication for important intellectual content, I don't feel it's my place to be a co-author on these, because I'm the instructor, right? I'm a mentor to them. And frankly, for me, it's not important to be listed on there. It doesn't, if I have a review article on palliative care, that's not going to help with my work in science communication, right, and teaching of science communication. So just to give you a little bit of context to this, but if somebody might have not worked on the actual data collection or analysis, but then maybe becomes sort of a main writer or really helps with shaping the article, they also would deserve authorship. And the last one is important. That is always a given. Anybody who's listed as an author must consent to be an author on the manuscript and provide final approval of the version to be published. So that is a really important step that often gets overlooked, because people add folks in like what they call gift authorship. Like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have, Mrs. Big Name, Professor Big Name on our publication? Let's just add them because they're affiliated with our lab. People have to consent, right? We're in the age of consent, thankfully. People have to consent to be authors. And actually today, most electronic submissions for journals, everybody's listed as an author, usually gets an automated email from the submission program, and they have to consent to be authors of this publication. So this is becoming a little easier to manage because technology is allowing us to, directly, these programs can directly communicate with every author, because you got to submit their names and email addresses. They then have to individually consent to be an author. But that's really, really important. So let's look at a breakdown of this. So Professor Pouchet broke this down a little bit. So let me really focus on substantial contributions for both of these categories. Let me go back one slide. So both substantial contribution to conception and design, and so on, substantial contribution, drafting, review. So you might ask yourself, and I think you should, all of us should, what is a substantial contribution? And a lot of that can be determined by the principal or lead investigator, who tends to be the first author of the paper. It's a little different when you're if you're a doctoral student, you'll probably be the first author, and then your principal investigator, the person who leads the lab, will most likely be the last author. And I'll talk about order of authorship again in the last slide, so keep that in mind. But again, the focus here is on what does substantial mean. So Professor Pouchet offers some suggestions here. Typically must have some what he calls intellectual component: conception, design, analysis, interpretation, drafting, revising. So what he would not include, and this, like for example, I've been included in all of the acknowledgments of my students in my who published articles coming out of my class, and that's a great place for me to be. But so in this case, reagent manufacturers, and keep in mind, right, he's from anatomy and neurobiology, so these are very specific to his field. But any kind of routine fee for service corps staff, funding body, blah blah blah. I disagree actually with the last item here, general lab support staff. I personally think they should be included as authors. There is a little bit of how can I say this, controversy around this in some of the professors I've talked to who run their own labs around this. I do think though that there's a much more of a equity-based understanding of who really, these folks do contribute substantially to the work. So keep that in mind as you go back to the slide at some point. General lab support staff, there is some disagreement around that, because again, some people feel like I do, people need to be included. And then maybe, again, general lab support staff, you put it under maybe, so there you go. I remember having this discussion. I went to a presentation he gave years ago when I asked him to give these slides, if I could have the slides, and he agreed. And there was actually a debate. It was a Zoom meeting. It was really debated in the comments a lot, because some people felt very strongly either way. So just keep in mind that might be a situation you might find yourself in, depending on where your work in SciComm takes you. So last slide that I mentioned earlier about authorship and roles. So the most important roles are really the first author and the last author, because the last author often is often the corresponding author. So they're the ones who serve as the contact with the editor of the journal, or the editors. However, in reality, sometimes the first author does that too, especially if the last author is the PI and it's the first one is a doctoral student or postdoc fellow. They usually are also involved in the in the corresponding with the journal. So that role as a last author is usually, it is reserved in these collaborative spaces in science in particular for the principal investigator, unless the principal investigator is the main author of the first author of the paper, right? But often, right, the way that labs work and these projects work, you have doctoral students and postdocs that work on their own projects that are part of the larger labs project, and they need to actually get first author articles out as well. So that's sort of the way it works in a lot of labs and a lot of scientific and a lot of science investigative areas. And by lab, I just don't mean a lab physically, like in chemistry lab, you put or in a physical space, but also when folks collect data, let's say for a geology survey. So, right, it's lab really means a much larger scientific inquiry space. So ways to organize authors is most common the order of relative contribution, which is the first author is the one who did the major work, the major writing, the major revising, the major drafting. And sometimes that can cause conflict, because sometimes the second or third authors feel they've done as much, if not more, as the first author. So this is why it's absolutely critical that when you're working with the authorship team, to have these transparent, continuous conversations on who gets put where. Because I've known people who have been deeply dissatisfied with being put in second place as authors. They felt they had first author rights, and it can cause to frictions and just really uncomfortable situations, and ultimately to real rifts within, among colleagues. But again, this most common way to organize authors is the order of relative contribution. So if you have a list of, let's say, 8 authors, the first 2 or 3 authors are the ones who are most heavily involved. The last one is usually the PI, or what they call the head honcho, whatever terminology you want to use. And in between, by order of relevance, folks who have contributed to the work. Okay. Other ways to organize authors are to have an alphabetical list. There's some, I think, mathematicians. I've seen a blog the other day that said we just list everybody alphabetical order. That's it. Makes it easier. There's no hierarchical implications there. That is not the norm, though, I think, in particularly scientific writing and scientific publishing. There are also ways to organize authors. Again, you still use the order of relative contribution, and if there's 3 people who did equal work, only one person can be the first space, right? There can only be one first space, the way that we linearly organize authorship in this, in our conceptual world here, in most Western countries. You can have multiple first authors. So you can add a footnote saying authors, Smith, Johnson, and Chernow, which is my maiden name, just FYI. Smith, Maiden, and Chernow all equally contributed to this article, to this article, and should all be considered first authors, right? Even though only one person can list it as. So then these 3 folks, Smith, Johnson, I forgot what name it is. Let's say Smith, Johnson, and Chernow. I guess so. Let's say Chernow is last. Chernow could argue then saying like, hey, when they submit their paper or put it on their CV and submit this for tenure review or for advancement review, saying, I'm a first author on this paper, even though I'm not listed as the actual first author. The same thing can happen with last authors. You can explain in footnotes or something similar, saying there are 3 main folks, who were such as corresponding authors for this project. So those are all options that require some additional work and explanation, and more journals are doing that. So pay attention as you're reading your work in your field. You might see footnotes saying, or even in an acknowledgement section or somewhere, some explanation of explaining the authorship. And more we also see saying, actually listing, so of all the 8 people, let's say, listed as authors, a clear explanation of how each of them has contributed to the article. So author Shukra has contributed by doing XYZ. Author Hyun Jin has contributed these particular ways. Author Smith has contributed these particular ways. So we'll see more and more of that. And I welcome this, and I think most of us do, because it adds to transparency and equity ultimately in scientific publishing.